Hello, friends. I wanted to spend some time to talk about a eulogy I read by the psychologist Jordan Peterson about his father's passing. And I found this to be a really touching and informative eulogy, but also tried to learn from it because I think Walter Peterson is a rare type of man, and we don't see a lot of people like him anymore these days, both as men, but just as people in general. And I got a chance to spend some time with Jordan Peterson and his family a couple months ago, and I was really touched and impressed. And I wanted to share this with you as well, because I think there's so much we can learn from the life of Walter Peterson. All right, so here is a nice picture of Walter Peterson. And I'm going to start by just going through the eulogy. So he lived a full something like 87 years in Canada. And here's how Jordan starts. Walter, Wally, Pete Peterson was a husband to Beverly Peterson, who predeceased him by only 5 months, a father to Jordan, Tammy, Bonnie, Jim Keller, and Joel, Kathleen, a grandfather to Mikhaila, Julian, Catherine, and Natalie, a great-grandfather to Elizabeth, Elliot, Shirley, and George. He spent his earliest years, when the language at home was Norwegian, in a log cabin on the Saskatchewan prairie, where his grandfather, Burnt, grandmother Clara, and father Stanley and mother Bernice had a homestead that was near Nicam, where he grew up and then fell in love and married Beverly, who was the only woman he ever had eyes for. Walter and Beverly were both of the generation where loyalty, as well as hard work and hospitality, were valued above all. He worked as a teacher for much of his life and was outstanding at that. Many of the elementary students who were fortunate enough to be in his class regarded him as the finest instructor they had ever had, particularly with regard to reading and math. As a disciplinarian, he could be fearsome. Acting up in Wally's class was not the world's best idea. In consequence, there was very little trouble among the students he strived to set right, and they could truly learn. Dad loved kids. He was great with them, and his children and grandchildren benefited immensely because of that. The latter were city kids, essentially, but he taught them to be comfortable in nature, to be independent, to love reading, to become comfortable with numbers, to use guns and bows and arrows, to boat, to understand life outside the confines of the urban world, and to aim high. After his teaching career, Walter worked in the audiovisual department of the Fairview School Board and then ran All Seasons Sports Center. When he retired, he continued to teach firearm safety as well as hunter training to many people in the community. Walter and Bev had an extensive social network in Fairview. Their house was always full of people, the hunters and rifle enthusiasts who were Dad's friends and often admirers, the couples that both of them adored. They camped with many of their close friends and family. It was a rare weekend when Walter and Bev's kids were still at home when they were not at a nearby lake. They traveled extensively too by car at the time, journeying throughout British Columbia, Alberta, Saskatchewan, as well to the northern U.S. Later in their life, Bonnie took them both on a safari to Africa and to Norway on their 25th wedding anniversary. They were frequent visitors to Montreal, Boston, Redwood City, and Regina, returning typically to Saskatchewan for much of the summer. The twin cabins at Little Bear Lake were the frequent gathering place of the entire Peterson clan, as well as many of Mom and Dad's close friends and relatives. Walter was a man who was loved, liked, and respected. He didn't suffer fools gladly, although, as Beverly told her children, his bark, which was formidable, was worse than his bite. He had high standards, and he upheld them. He was a complex, intelligent, conscientious, straightforward, an honest man, a bit of a mystery to himself and those around him, a bit fearsome to behold, but someone who was resolutely on the side of whatever was best in his children and his friends. He had a streak of stubbornness that made him a force to contend with, was a man of his word, and truly someone who could be relied upon for a word of truth and whatever support was necessary and helpful. Dad had the force of nature about him. He will be greatly missed. A memorial will be held for him at Waterhole, just outside of Fairview, on July 19th. 2025 weekend. More details will follow. In lieu of flowers, donations to Alberta Hunter Education Instructor Association would be appropriate and welcome. Wow. I just wanted to reflect on this because I think there's so much we can learn from the life of Walter Peterson and the way Jordan, his son, has described this. But first of all, I think Walter was defined by his relationships. As you see, the way the eulogy introduced him, I learned from this that we're really not an island. And one of the amazing things about this person's life was his rich social life and deep connections to his family, a large family, and his many friends. And we don't see that as much these days, as many people don't even have children. And even when they do, they're quite isolated and disconnected from their communities, with social isolation and loneliness as an epidemic. So I learned from Walter to seek out and cultivate that garden of reciprocal love and non-reciprocal love in families. In addition, he talks about his wife and his mother, Jordan's mother, and Walter's wife in such a touching way, the way that they met as youngsters and lived their whole life, probably married for 60 plus years. When his wife died, when Walter's wife died, he died 5 months later. And this is an effect that social scientists and physicians have observed. In many ways, it's a sign of deep love and connection and interdependence that is very rare, also getting more rare these days as divorce is so common and people have fewer long-term commitments generally, but especially in the domain of romantic love. So I think of Walter and his wife. I smile with a twinkle in my eye, just imagining the beauty and love between them. And I find that very touching. In addition, I think there's loyalty, his hard work, his hospitality, those kind of virtues. You may think of your own grandparents when you heard that eulogy, but a man of his word, a straightforward man who has all those traditional virtues that we see lacking often. Just think of loyalty, somebody who's just going to be there for you because they're loyal. That's it. Very simple. Hard work as opposed to making excuses, blaming everyone else for one's problems, taking responsibility for your life. That's a grandpa wisdom that we should all learn from. And the hospitality he showed to people around him, this is a great virtue of hospitality in a lot of different cultures, but in the transactional world where relationships are just modified or glamorized business transactions, and hospitality is one of these virtues that gets minimized. And the other thing about Walter from this eulogy that I learned is he had a lot of high standards. He aimed high. And we don't really hear that either very much. That, hey, like shoot for the stars, aim for the fences. Don't start off compromising. Start off really trying to do amazing things. I think that's just beautiful. I can just imagine him talking to his grandchildren with those words. In addition, he was a teacher, and part of his teaching philosophy was discipline. So obviously he was stern in many ways with his students and with his family, but I think we've forgotten that part of learning requires discipline. It's such a commonsensical thing, but yeah, of course, when you have discipline, then you can learn. It's not as though you can learn first and then develop discipline. The discipline is a prerequisite for opening one's mind to learn, and the sternness with which he helped children regulate themselves, regulate their emotions, regulate their days, find structure in their days. That's a real prerequisite to being able to learn and also to grow as a human being. These days, we don't really hear that. That virtue is minimized as well, whereas we hear more about just look inside yourself, see how you feel and express it. I mean, I think that's a recipe for disaster because our inner life is uncultivated and it's inchoate, it's contradictory. We have different selves in ourself. How do we know which ones to listen to? How do we prioritize long-term and short-term? So we need that structure and that discipline to learn and also to grow. So I found that quite admirable. In addition, Walter was enmeshed in nature. He talks about the lake. He talks about trapping, hunting, going with his family to the cabin. Whereas these days we are so disconnected from nature, and we were designed and evolved to be in nature. Lots of anxiety, depression are minimized when we're in nature. The Japanese call it forest bathing, where you walk in a forest and you feel bathed by the great, beautiful feeling of being connected to the world. That's another thing I learned from this life of Walter Peterson, the importance of reconnecting with nature, getting out of the concrete jungles, and finding peace in that way. But while also staying connected, not living in a bungalow somewhere just in the middle of nowhere, never being connected to people. He was an involved father. Walter, he loved kids. He was involved as a grandpa, but also as a father. He's very involved. And I think that's beautiful because so many children suffer with parents and especially fathers who are not present. Today, depending on the group and depending on the context and the culture, something like anywhere from like 11 to 70% of children are born with parents being not married. So that sets the child up for a precarious life. And Walter was super involved as a dad and a grandpa and married to his wife for 60 years. It's just amazing. We don't see that very much. And I think our children deserve that. I really admire that about him. Walter was a rooted person. And I think this is a really wise thing that I take from it as well. Being rooted feels like we're giving up our freedom. Oh, I don't want to be connected. I don't want to be locked down to a place, to a person, to a community. But Walter's not this globetrotter who's just running around disconnected with many acquaintances and superficial connections. He had a full life because he was rooted and because he was intimately connected to a particular place, a particular town, a particular community, particular people, even a province. He talks about the province in Canada. So the particularity of life is really what makes life colorful and also what creates the possibility for all these other beautiful virtues to blossom. So I learned that from seeing this even brief glimpse into the life of Walter Peterson. So the other thing is that he was really connected to a trade, both teaching, but also with hunting and teaching people after he retired. He was connected to a profession, and traditionally people would join a profession, they would be mentored or apprenticed into it, and that will be part of who they are. There was a sense that you are contributing to a profession, but also that you are investing in it in a way that it will contribute to people after you're long gone. So I learned that from him too. Even if you look at where he wanted the flowers to go, the Alberta Hunter Education Instructor Association, it's almost like, hey, like I'm committed to this and I want this to persist after I'm gone. And so having these connections to things beyond the self that are moral and virtuous and are connected to not just, hey, I have a best friend, but you see all these layers to his life, so many layers. And he's a complex guy, but he also has many complex moral and virtuous layers. And I think that's really beautiful. Yeah, I hope this is helpful. I hope this reflection is helpful. And yeah, I hope I've been able to share some thoughts just from my view of things as a social scientist and a clinician. And yeah, my condolences to the Peterson family, and God bless Walter Peterson and the whole family. Take care.